with the emergence of huge technology trends. So in the case of the 1970s, it was the PC revolution. In the case of the late 1990s, it was the internet revolution. Those two things, which required enormous progress in both physical infrastructure, so atoms, as well as software infrastructure, bits, when you put those two things together, those also created big companies. And so if you add that all up, the point is that whenever you see huge tectonic shifts in technology combined with periods of austerity, that's when the gargantuan dollars are made. So in the 1970s, companies like Microsoft and Apple from the get-go had to be profitable, right? And in the absence of one very important round of financing that Amazon was able to close, the next big wad of companies were founded again in rising rates where they just had to get profitable or find a way to be positive free cash flow or have positive working capital faster than anybody else. So these are like really interesting trends that I think just say that as rates creep back up, and if we can intersect that with some improvements in technology over the next 5 to 10 years that we've all talked about, it could be a real boon for startups and startup investing.
It would mean people are a little more resilient, a little more hardcore, to use a term. Freeberg, what are your thoughts on this analysis by Social Capital?
It's interesting. I mean, I think there's probably two ways you could interpret this. One is in an era of excess capital, all the capital gets competed away. And so you pay more salaries, you have, it's harder to get high quality talent, you make a lower margin, et cetera, et cetera. It's much more kind of competitive on the ground. And then another one is just obviously kind of like evolutionary fitness. When there's less capital, investors are more selective. I think what might make this era a little bit different than the past is just the amount of termed dry powder sitting on the sidelines right now. So the total VC capital raised last year, I think, was a record high. That means there's a lot more cash that needs to kind of be deployed in the next 12 to 36 months than has ever been deployed in the history of venture, if that holds true. So that may be kind of a counterbalancing effect here, where it may take 3 years before that effect plays out, where there's more of a dearth of capital. It's certainly the case that institutional investors, endowments, pension funds, traditional family office LPs, and venture funds are making far fewer commitments this year to new funds, as I think we all know. And that tightening will play out in the venture funds that'll get raised for this vintage, the next vintage, and so on. And so maybe that kind of evolutionary fitness concept starts to play out later.
And sizing. And sizing.
I think there's also this, like, we talked about this on our text stream, but the venture business of the last 15 years, everyone since 2008, everyone's been trained, and all the younger people that have come up and are now partners and running the firms on an environment of momentum investing rather than fundamental investing. And so there is also a question of how fit the investors are for a market space where valuations are flat or descending, or the decision whether or not to invest is no longer driven by who else is investing and how much is the company growing and how much is their valuation going up. But it's much more about kind of the fundamental performance of the business.
Does this match what you're seeing on the ground, Sachs? Are people being more dogmatic, pragmatic? Are the capital allocators really sharpening the knives and looking at these businesses a different way? Is it actually hit the streets?
Yes, there's a record amount of money, venture capital was raised over the last, couple of years, but it's going to be deployed much more slowly and carefully over the next, say, 3 or 4 years than it was over the previous few years. So divide that amount of money by 3 or 4, because the pace of deployment is going to go way down. And so, yeah, I think people are going to be more careful. They're going to take longer to make decisions. I think it's going to be much, much harder for new funds to get started. All of the, hype around, solo capitalists and, all these, seed funds and micro VCs and all this kind of stuff. I think a lot of that's going to get washed away. I think in hindsight, a lot of that was a product of the bubble. And yeah, I think you're going to be in for a period of some retrenchment in VC. And I think that's good. I mean, I think to the point of Chamath's study that, that the counterintuitive finding in his study was that great companies are created during times when we're not in a bubble and capital is sloshing around everywhere, but when you're in an environment of moderate capital availability. And I think the point is that we all have to be under some stress, right? That's what evolution requires is, if an ecosystem or an organism is not under stress, they have no pressure to evolve and become fitter and compete. And I think that's what makes our industry and our ecosystem very adaptive over time, is that it's constantly, it does face survival pressures. But over the last several years, all the survival pressures were taken away because anybody could raise money. And
there was always another bridge available. There was always some extension, and there was
some convertible note to be done.
Right.
There was no reckoning. A lot of these companies just seem to, get another 12 months of runway, another 12 months of runway.
Founders learned so many bad habits during that period of time, and so much entitlement and excess built up in the system during that time. And I think now we're seeing that a lot of that is working its way out. I mean, just look at the Facebook results the other day.
So
let's talk about Facebook as an example, because here you have a company where the stock over the past year had been pounded. It was like down over 50%. And the market
$90 a share.
The market did not like its answers around the capital investments it was making. And then Brad Gerstner, our friend, wrote that letter encouraging them to get much more efficient. And then they did that. And they basically started doing some riffs and basically just getting much more efficient in what they're doing, and specifically taking out layers and layers of middle management. I mean, that was really the big thing. So they kind of took a page out of Elon's book in terms of what Elon had done at Twitter. I mean, not nearly to that extent, because I don't think they needed to, but they targeted this idea of we have too many layers in the company, too many mid-level managers. And the stock ripped just, was it like up 20, 25%?
Yeah, in a day.
Yesterday.
And they're up to, I actually bought it the day they had the layoffs. I put in a buy order and it was closed at $94, and now it's at $193. And FedEx, of all places, is laying off 10% of its officers and directors. So the idea now is, hey, in the senior ranks, what is the inefficiency there? How do we get more doers, more people who actually are building or operating the companies to take the reins and get rid of this, as you're saying, middle management, this waste that companies have?
Let me tell you specifically the problem that builds up in these companies is that everybody wants to be a manager. And so you can't just come at this problem by saying we're going to increase the number of reports that each manager has from 5 to 10. That doesn't work, because let me tell you what happens is that every individual contributor who's a star thinks that their career advancement